Anna. I am a dev at Hive Homes, which is a smart homes company under British Gas. And I'm here to talk today about our experience with developing serverless application, which is production, used 100% in production, and it is quite large. So we're talking about quite a large-scale application and the difficulties that we were facing when trying to develop it. Because when I heard first time about serverless some 2 years ago, I was for a long time in this like honeymoon period where it was like, you know, everything was great, serverless was amazing, it was like everything that you could dream about. But in the last half a year, when I was working at Hive, and when I started working at Hive, I realized that there are quite a few interesting problems that you might need to solve if you really want to use serverless in production on a large scale. So this is the company I work for, and we do a lot of different smart home stuff. We started with a thermostat, now we have 4 different thermostats. We've got all kinds of sensors, like window door sensor, sound sensor, motion sensor. We've got 4 different types of light bulbs. We've got active plugs, plus some cameras and other devices. So just the devices are quite complicated. But you can also have actions between 2 items, such as if a window opens, turn on the light bulb. So there's a complexity in between of the devices. Plus you can schedule your devices, you can control them manually, you can control them even when you're not at home. So there's a lot of stuff going on in our ecosystem because there's just a lot of things there that we need to manage. And our infrastructure is a pretty typical one where we have the hardware layer, which is the actual devices. Then we have some API above that, which is controlling the devices. And then my team and a few others are responsible for developing the actual apps that then people use to control the devices. The obvious problem most front-end devs will know about is that the people who do the API layer do it for the devices, they don't do it for us. So we end up with incredible amount of weird shaped data, half of it we don't even need, and then we are like, you know, what do we do about this? So we started by having like a layer within our app, and then we extracted it away into an experiential layer of the API. And that lives in serverless. That's our serverless application. So we've got this ideally very thin but quite large layer, which is translating, interpreting the data from the API for the use of the front-end application. And this is what I want to talk about today because, as I mentioned, we have quite a lot of things going on. And ideally, serverless, you would say it should be used for microservices. But in our case, that is not really the thing we want to do with it. We just want to take some data, translate it, send it onwards. But we need to do that for a lot of different kinds of data. So when I started working there half a year ago, everything was on serverless 0.5, on the serverless framework 0.5, because they started developing it 2 years ago. And I came in full of enthusiasm and I said, okay, I'm going to move everything into serverless 1. All the 50+ functions, all the endpoints, you know, and it's going to be great. It's going to be much easier with serverless 1. And so I started the journey, and then I got stuck because it's not just about moving one function after another. It is about hitting really weird roadblocks that I never hit before, although I had quite a lot of experience with serverless by that point. And that is because of the sheer size. So I kept sort of like trying and trying and trying until now. I didn't like move it all the way to the flags. There are still few functions that I need to move. And by now, all my colleagues believe that I will hit another roadblock again and I'll end up in the middle. But I believe not. I believe that we have now solved all the issues and that from now on, it's just going to be paradise again. So the biggest question that I kept having problems with was the size of the service. Because really, how large can a service like that get? Well, really, really, really large. There are so many things to think about. I'm not talking about scaling application in terms of the number of people who hit it, because that is sorted out. That is managed for us, and that's easy. But serverless, and I'm talking about Serverless Framework and AWS at the same time, doesn't really deal well with large applications in the sense of like a lot of functionality. There are so many limits in terms of resources, policies, how the config is structured, and the file size that you all have to take into account. The first roadblock that we hit within like a month or two of developing was that AWS allows you to only have 200 resources in your CloudFormation template, which would be easy if we weren't using Serverless Framework because you can have nested stacks, and then that's all sorted out. But Serverless by default doesn't nest anything. It's just like one thing, and then when you hit 200, that's it. Another issue was that we had 10 megabytes of policy file size. That's the AWS limit again. With both of these things, you might think, that limit is really generous. 200 resources, how do you hit that thing? It's surprisingly easy because with every function you deploy also a log stream and a log group. You also deploy the API endpoint. So there are like 4 to 5 resources for every single function that you deploy. So the moment you have a relatively large application, you are getting very dangerously close to that limit. In terms of 10 megabyte policy size, when you think about it, policy is just words, right? It's just characters that possibly can't have that much information in it that it would reach 10 megabytes. Well, it does, because Serverless Framework by default will package everything into one huge policy for everything. So hitting 10 megabytes when you have 50 functions, and now you control not only access of the functions to logs, but also of the API gateway to the functions themselves. So there are a lot of policies that you need to set up right. And that's why it's nice that Serverless Framework hides all of this away from you, that you don't have to deal with it until you hit the limit, and then you have to deal with it. Fortunately, as always, there are plugins for everything in Serverless, but it took me like 6 weeks to set it up right. And that's literally like these 4 lines of code. That's all I had to do in the end. But figuring out which 4 lines of code to do, that was really difficult. And I've got a huge thanks to Doug, who in the end sorted out for me. He's the guy who wrote the Split Stacks plugin, which is basically a thing which takes the resources that can be nested and nests them into separate stacks. So right now, our application runs on 5 different CloudFormation stacks. One is the main one, and then there are the 4 nested stacks. And there is a custom roles plugin, which surprisingly doesn't just do custom roles. I'm not using it for custom roles at all. What it does is that it splits the ginormous policy file into subsections. So every single function will have its own policy, which in turn increases the amount of resources. And we again hit the 200 resources block. And then we have to create its own separate stack just for roles. So this was the whole journey of sort of like running in circles, of hitting different limits all the time. But this, I think, is the right way of doing it, and hopefully won't break again. Then there is another thing that surprised us quite a lot. We work with JavaScript. We pack everything with Webpack, as you do, so that we can use all the fancy new Node 8 things. But when you Webpack everything, and with Serverless 1, with the Webpack plugin for Serverless 1, when you pack everything, send it off to the server or to the cloud, you suddenly realize that your functions that used to be like half a meg or 1 meg are suddenly 23 megabytes, every single one of them. And then I had to actually go through the serverless source code to figure this one out, because it's not obviously written in any docs. They pack every single function together. They pack the whole service and upload it like function by function. But every single function will have all the code that you have written in your service. Thankfully, there is a very simple thing. You can just say, please package them individually. I don't understand why. Why would you actually have to write this? Of course I want them packaged individually. Why would I want to have all the other code there? Well, there you go. So that was like 2 days of my work, trying to figure out why is it so huge, and then turning out that there is this one mention in the README for the Webpack plugin somewhere at the bottom saying, by the way, if you don't want huge file sizes, this is the way to go. It was quite interesting, by the way, because since every single function was so huge, it still uploaded every single function. So I had 40 packages. All of them had the same function code. And when I had to upload them all, my network at home would just break down. It just couldn't handle the amount of uploading that I was doing on it. So yeah, remember to package everything individually because that by default is not a thing. And then last but not least, in terms of the sizing, when you move from serverless 0.5 to serverless 1, there is one huge change in terms of the config. Originally, every single function had its own config, but now in serverless framework these days, you have just one config, which is quite nice in many ways because that means that you have like a really nice sort of log of everything that your service can do, which is great. But then when you have quite a few functions, you had like 400 lines of config, so you can imagine that all day long you're just scrolling, trying to find the one place that you want to change. Well, the serverless YAML is not a standard YAML file. You can actually import other files into it, so we ended up splitting the serverless YAML file into specifications of all the policies and the service itself, and then the functions you can have, they are still listed there. But they are actually not mentioning the config itself. We are just saying, look for the config for the function itself in the function folder. And then in the function folder, we have another serverless YAML, which is just defining that one function. So we kind of had to move back on the decision that the serverless team made to have everything in one file back to having it in multiple files, because otherwise it would just be unmanageable for us. So that was it for the sizing. I think that was like pretty much everything that you will hit when you're trying to run a really large app. But the other problem is that if you're using serverless to do what we are doing, and I think that's quite a common use case actually, to have experiential layer which translates other things. I suppose you can also have it with GraphQL, etc. But the idea is that you have this whole application that you want to run with your front end to check that your changes that you did to the backend actually work. And serverless, because there are no servers, don't allow you to do that unless you deploy everything, every single resource to like a new stage, which with 50 functions and Webpack packaging takes 20, 30 minutes. So that's not something that you actually want to do. And the ultimate answer here is that not only you want to run one function locally, you want to run all of them locally at the same time, which paradoxically means that you need to introduce a server to your serverless application, create some kind of express wrapper for it, so that you can then be able to just plug in your local version of the serverless app that is now running on a server, so that you can try it out with your front end without having to deploy it. I was looking today at various plugins that might do it, and I was quite disappointed that I found out that they are either inactive or the one Serverless Offline, which is the main one that could do this for us, is actually, I think the owner just said that he doesn't want to really do it anymore. So there is no ready-made solution that would actually make me feel like I want to use it, made me feel that I can actually still use it in 3 months' time. One of my colleagues actually wrote our own wrapper. It's super simple. It's like 30 lines of code. It literally just takes all the function definitions from the serverless 0.5 version and just sends the data to them. So it kind of pretends it's a very primitive API gateway. But I think that's one problem that, generally speaking, a lot of people can afford to ignore until the application becomes very large. So once you have a lot of endpoints, you kind of want to try to see that your change didn't break any single one of them. So that is, again, one consideration to take. So after like 5 months of struggling with this, a lot of people are asking me, is it actually worth it for your particular use case to actually do serverless? And I'd say absolutely yes. It's still amazing that it does so much work for us. You know, we don't have to manage anything, we don't have to manage scaling. You know, it still does a lot of stuff for us. It's just that the configuration of getting there, those 6 or 7 lines of code that I had to write, it was incredibly difficult to figure out which 7 lines of code to do in order to make it work. Probably because a lot of people don't have this use case of having really large serverless applications in production. But I also think that that is something that we will be hitting more and more of us will. And that's why I wanted to do this talk, so that we have like a record of all these things are the things that you need to do in order to get there. And hopefully if there are more things, or if you feel like there is a better way of doing it, do let me know. I'd love to add it to my next talk or next blog. Thank you very much.